Good evening, room members, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Andrew Karue, also a member of the room, and it is my privilege to be hosting this evening's member-led event here at the room. So a little about me. I am in the actuarial profession by training, with over 15 years experience in the insurance industry, as well as an accredited independent director with the CIDA Group. Currently, I am a business consultant, providing mentoring and consulting services to SMEs and family-owned businesses in the areas of governance and risk management. So my passion in governance and risk management is mainly due to my passion to see SMEs succeed in Kenya and in the wider African region. I believe that SMEs are the engine for growth in Africa and will provide the bulk of employment for the youth in Africa. However, I have noted that for SMEs to succeed in Kenya and beyond, they need to put in place some foundational business practices that will see them move from being the one-man show type of business, or what we refer to here at CIDA as craft business, to an enterprise type of business, which is grounded on good governance practices and is able to scale and attract investors and appropriate financing. In Kenya, unfortunately, we have seen a number of companies collapsing over the last few years due to poor corporate governance practices, including famous companies such as Nakumat and even more recently Tuskys. And these were family-owned businesses in the retail sector. We've also seen a number of parastatals which are now looking to be bailed out by the government. Yet, these problems could have been avoided by looking at similar failures abroad and where such events have happened in the past, and adopting best practices and governance structures that will see our businesses build to last and leaving a legacy. And so it is my pleasure this evening to invite Roger Hitchcock, a seasoned speaker and knowledgeable thought leader who regularly facilitates webinars and learning opportunities in the corporate governance space. He has worked together with the CIDA team since 2014, bringing with him over 12 years experience in training directors across Africa and more than 30 years of business experience, including family business, corporate, non-profit, and entrepreneurial endeavors. He enjoys seeing people grow as they apply what they have learned and making a difference by doing what he does well. He says that this takes learning constantly and applying what he learns from his target of reading 40 to 60 books per year. Having personally held a number of directorships, Roger speaks from lived boardroom experience. His directorship experience ranges from serving as executive director in the consulting and education sector to holding non-executive positions in the mining, retail, and non-profit sectors. He is also an accredited CIDA independent director. He has facilitated numerous sessions on topics such as governance, consumer protection, ethics, stakeholder management, board evaluations, and several others. These were held across a multitude of industries and a number of countries throughout Africa, including clients such as the Kenya Association of Manufacturing here in Kenya, Society for Corporate Governance in Nigeria, Future Leaders in Namibia, the South African Reserve Bank, Young Presidents Organization, and the China-Europe International Business School. So once again, please help me welcome Roger as he presents to us today's topic on ISO 37000, the new standard on corporate governance. Welcome, Roger.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm just going to try to get my camera in focus. It means I've just got to kind of step off screen quickly, step back again. It's hopefully that gets me right. Let me try one other thing. You're going to see my screen just change. Apologies for these. Sometimes happens when we are setting up webinars, but it's my privilege and my pleasure to spend this time together with you. That's much better. And great that we can look at something that is, brand new in the governance space, brand new in some senses, but also in other senses, a reflection of multiple developments in the governance space and a formulation, I suppose, of some of the latest thinking into a brand new, the first ever international code or standard on organizational governance called ISO 37000. And as we go through this session together, the aim is to spend about an hour together, to spend about 40 minutes or so talking through some key aspects of ISO 37000, but also to have questions and answers as we go. And so in front of me, I have the Q&A box. So if there are any questions you have as we go, and as those pop up, what I will either do is answer them as they appear, or I will pick up on those as we get to the end of our time together. So please, as we go, do not hesitate to ask questions. But it would be good also for you to let us know where you are logging on from. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat box, just telling us where you're logging on from. I'm from Pretoria, South Africa, and it's my privilege to present to you this evening as well. I have had some experience with the room, which is very exciting to be talking to you under that banner and on behalf of the room, and thanks again for that, for the invite. We ran a couple of years ago, we ran one of our long-term programs, 11-month programs specifically for the room, and that was a privilege and a pleasure. So ISO 37000, and again, some people say ISO 37000, some people say ISO 37000. I haven't really got to what's right at this stage, so I'll refer to it as ISO 37000. And those of us in business know that ISO, the International Standards Organization, is a significant party in thinking about and putting together frameworks for best practice. And I want to talk through how ISO 37000 is in some senses similar. It's certainly a consolidation of best practice, but in some senses, it's also quite different from many others of the standards that we would refer to. ISO 9000 on quality management, ISO 31000 on risk management. Because in a sense, it's governance is something that doesn't quite fit the box of a set of parameters that we just tick through. It requires us to do this thing called apply and explain. And during the course of this evening, I want to just spend a bit of time unpacking what that means in practice, because at the end of the day, governance has to be fit for purpose. It has to be customized. It has to be specifically thought through by a board of directors and designed for the sector, the stage of business, the type of business that they serve within. Let me tell you a little bit about Sadar. Where are we coming from as Sadar? Sadar provides services throughout a large part of Africa. We're also currently working with partners in New Zealand. We're also working with other parties through the Middle East and exploring options in the States as well. We provide an integrated boardroom solution. What we mean by that is we certainly provide the training part of what does it mean to be a director, everything from the legalities of directors' duties right through, as Andrew has alluded to, certain of the topics, risks, stakeholders, all of those different areas, strategy facilitation. We work currently with a number of family businesses in helping govern both the family side of that equation and the business side of that equation. We also then, alongside the education, provide a service of appointing different directors and really running a network. We have a network called the Sadar Director Network, where those are people who've expressed an interest in actively becoming independent directors on boards, and we help some of that matching process. But fundamentally as well, and undergirding that, we also help companies at various stages in their life cycle implement, put in place a board process, or even a governance process, because sometimes a board process sounds really formal. And so different companies at different stages get that at different levels of formality. You see, governance is something that every business, every entity needs to think through and apply effectively from day one. And that's essentially the principle or the parameters behind or undergirding ISO 37000. And there are 5 or 6 different topics I want to pull out of this. What you see in front of you is a visual representation of ISO 37000. What I like about it is it's simple and straightforward. Too often governance is made this thing that is obscure and difficult to come to terms with. And I'll explain to you as we go why we have these concentric circles with purpose at the core, one of the key points I want to make, and that circle of responsible stewardship, effective performance, ethical behavior on the outside, and how that is based on some of the latest thinking in how do we determine whether an organization is well governed or not. Let's dive in at the beginning and touch on a few key points. And first key point is that ISO 37000 aims to provide a recognized set of guidelines and guidance on best practice in the governance space. The first significant point is that there is significant agreement and significant scope of application undergirding ISO 37000. How the ISO organization works, International Standards Organization works, is they have representative parties in the vast majority of countries around the world, and the 70 countries that engaged around ISO 37000, there was 100% agreement from all participants in the process that this was a standard that was worth supporting, needed to be supported, needed to be, in a sense, recommended for application. You can see that second point there to all organizations, regardless of size, type, location, structure, and purpose. You see, often we think that governance only kicks in when our companies get to a significant size or profile. Actually, we need to govern from day one, and we do govern from day one, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes unintentionally, and sometimes that leads to certain significant problems, as alluded to by Andrew. Some of the examples of companies that have been in the headlines for the wrong reasons are because they haven't thought about this thing called governance early enough in the process. And what that means ultimately, and as we go through this and pick up some of these key features of ISO 37000, I want to say, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for us in our own businesses? And again, what would be helpful is, as we're going through, thanks, Ashok from Nairobi, if you could also just drop into the chat box, because there's not a huge group today, so it's great we can get some more interaction going. Also drop in whether you sit on a board, so what roles do you play in your business? And simply list them. Are you in management or operations? Are you a director? Or are you a shareholder, or are you all three? So just as you go, just list those 3 categories, because it's really important that we understand different responsibilities as those different roles. And here we're talking primarily to directorship level, but often in our businesses, if we don't have a formal board, the governance has to happen somewhere. And that's what's meant by this concept of all entities, regardless of type, structure, size. Every business needs to be governed. And so the response is, it's time to stop debating about governance and time to start doing it. What I mean by that, and this is a quote that I think is really, really powerful. I mentioned that phrase, apply and explain upfront. What apply and explain requires from us is that we think through the implications of governance for our entity. And Chesterton said that's unfortunately something that we often shrink back. There's a kind of work which any man can do, but from which many men shrink, generally because it's very hard work. The reality is to apply the principles of governance in various different types of entities is not necessarily an easy thing to do, sometimes because they fear it would lead them whither they do not want to go. It is called thinking. And the thinking part of the process is really, really critical. The challenge in an organizational context is that thinking is a team sport, because governance is a team sport. even if I use the term board of director, it sounds a bit strange because a board is actually a collective. ISO 37000 refers to the governing body, and the governing body is a group of people who govern. And so we need to learn to converse and talk and think together better than ever before. And I like to think about our thinking on a timeline, that if we put governing on a timeline, one of the most important things for governors to anticipate is what lies ahead. You'll see even in the ISO 37000 model, this is where things like, and we'll touch on purpose, but strategy, our model of value generation, where those things are really, really important, because it's not just about understanding what we have in the present. It's actually about what I call thinking forward. It's about the foresight we need to exercise as directors so that in our present role, which is the role of oversight, we can actually make sense of where the business is today based on where it needs to be or where we anticipate it being in the future. And that's a really important thing to think about as directors, is our role as directors in directing. By definition, in that word, there is this picture of someone pointing in a direction. There's a picture in governance of a board pointing in the same direction, and they point to that over time. And so they point to that into the future. Often we focus on, there's nothing wrong with looking back and learning, but if the dominant part of our conversation around the boardroom table is about what has happened, we're missing the opportunity of foresight. And that's really one of the challenges. And so let's agree that governance is something we all need. We all need the structures and systems and processes and policies. Why? Because our businesses need to be sustainable and viable into the future and over time. And that's an important part. So there is this very broad scope of application in ISO 37000, which means all boards need to be asking themselves the question, all governors, all business people, how do we engage with all of these different themes? I've highlighted a couple of them, but all of the other ones as well, and learning the skills of that and educating ourselves, educating one another about some of the challenges of engagement around those areas. The second thing, and this is in a sense even before we get into 2 or 3 points about the structure of ISO 37000, as I said, purpose and outcomes. But this is where this specific ISO standard doesn't fit the box of many of the other ISO standards. Many of the standards, like, as I mentioned, ISO 9000, which is about quality management, ISO 31000, which is about risk management, they provide us with very clear, very specific steps and stages to work through so that we can tick the box of having done that job well. And so they are quite, in many senses, prescriptive in the way that they are structured and in their approach. This specific standard is descriptive and not prescriptive. And this is where the real implication of apply and explain comes from, is that ultimately, your business isn't well governed simply because you have a ditto or duplicate policy from a business next door. Your business is well governed because of what the governance results in. And we'll touch on that during this time together. And so let's not look in governance for boxes to tick. The wrong way to read ISO 37000 is to say, well, what are the processes or the things we need to tick off under each of those elements: purpose, value generation, strategy. Rather, we have to think of what are the tool sets that help us apply those principles. And you can see that what those things are called, if you look at the table, is that there is a primary governance principle, which is purpose. There are foundational governance principles, which are the 4 around it: value generation, strategy, accountability, and oversight. There are enabling governance principles, and the word used here is very important. It's the word principles, in that we need to understand how do we apply that in our own business, and even how do we apply it over time as our businesses change and adapt and grow and flex. Because Every business, as it goes through its life cycle, changes in dynamic. A business grows, which is great, but the reality is a growing business requires a constantly evolving, adapting governance framework to facilitate that growth. Many businesses have been really struck hard by COVID, and some have had to scale down and pull back on and redesign and relook at their structures and governance frameworks. And so let's think of governance not as a boxes to tick, but as a framework that provides a space within our businesses, within which our businesses flourish. And again, the danger is that we look back for the answers instead of looking forward. No amount of sophistication, as per Wilson, is going to allay the fact that all our knowledge is about the past and all our decisions are about the future. One of the fundamental principles in governing is that governing is primarily a decision-making function. And I even hesitate to say the word function. What I mean is that if you were to boil down every business, no matter what its size, scope, etc., to its most basic elements, every single business, every single organization requires the making and implementing of decisions. And decisions can only change the future. Decisions can't change the past. So we certainly look back. We do exercise hindsight, we look at the present, but both of those things, the hindsight and the oversight, only make sense when we anticipate the future. And so here is one of the key things that I like to work with directors to help them do, is activate what I like to call the duty of imagination. We often think of directors' duties as legal duties, a fiduciary relationship. We have the duties of care, skill, and diligence. But actually, if we are thinking and we are engaging with the future and pursuing a future vision for the business and the organization, we can only do that with our imaginations and with our collective imagination around the table. And that's why putting the right board together is really, really critical. And so the key question is not whether to govern or not. It's what does governance look like here? How can we imagine a better way of being, a better way of structuring our decision-making, a better way of structuring the distribution of authority throughout the business or the organization so that we are actually more effective, more efficient, we accomplish what we set out to do. And that's the point behind this phrase that is undergirding ISO 37000, apply and explain. Also important to think, so that word apply and explain, or that phrase apply and explain, also has two different contexts, which is important to understand, is that as directors, we are the ones who wear, I like to call it, the accountability jacket. We are the ones who ultimately are answerable, should be willing to give an answer or account for, should be able to give an account for the performance, the impact of our businesses. And that's why we're seeing businesses that create damage or harm. The directors are the ones that are put in front of the spotlight, in a sense. And so that explain part of the process is we're not just applying and keeping it invisible. What the explain part of the process does is it makes it transparent and visible to whoever we need to give an account for. But the second part of that explain process is it creates the ability for directors to continually test their application internally before we necessarily have to give an account externally for it. And so a good part of a boardroom conversation, a boardroom review process, is to continually test your application and explanation of how you are governing. So those are two, in a sense, contextual elements. That first one of scope of application, scope of agreement. Second one, descriptive and not prescriptive. And so let's look for the right things. The third key element, and this is where we're getting into some of the core content of ISO 37000, is that it is a framework to align with international best practice. And the core of that is this thing called organizational purpose. And that's why it's a set of circles where we start at the center and we work our way out from the center, because it is the purpose that enlivens, it is the purpose that gives meaning to, it is the purpose that enables us to make decisions about all of the things that flow from that. And this concept, this thinking around organizational purpose, and especially here, if you've got questions, please drop them onto the chat box or comments into the Q&A box or the chat box. Really good to get any thoughts or feelings or questions from you as we go. But purpose has been a debate for a number of years in the organizational space, and it's shifted and ebbed and flowed from various things. And a gentleman that I really enjoy from a different perspective point of view is a gentleman called Charles Handy. He is now an elderly gentleman, well into his 80s. And he said in 2002, 20 years ago, he was asked to give a speech, what is a company for? And he said this, he said, companies should be managed as communities, for that's what they are. And he was a gentleman who took quite a different view to business, not ignoring the fact that businesses need to be financially viable and profitable, etc. But he stepped back from that and he said things like they're communities of employees organized to serve communities of customers. And when this is done using moral values, and so that is a word that is very much embedded in ISO 37000, the concept of value. And value comes from a moral base. Moral values, the system retains internal and external integrity. We work quite a lot with organizational culture, testing those things. And the word that often comes up is this word integrity. But integrity is based on a set of values, and that's important. Companies exist, Handy said, to create a community of wealth or a community of value. And that's really powerful because it talks to this concept of the why, which is the question at the center. Is all of us need to be asking the why question around our boardroom tables. Because once we've got that in play, we can answer the other questions. What does that look like? And so the expansion of this concept of organizational purpose is also important because it's not just a financial aspect. It's a range of different things. The governing body, and this is a quote out of ISO 37000, should ensure that the organizational purpose expresses its intentions with respect to the organization's stakeholders, society, commons, and their natural environment. We have to take a view of our businesses that aren't internal and introspective. We have to take a view because we are dependent on, and not what we only have internally, but we operate within a network, an ecosystem. The economy is an ecosystem of interdependency, and that's important for us to recognize when we're thinking about this concept of purpose. Furthermore, it should ensure that the organizational values and culture are aligned. And so purpose, values, and culture flow from one another. And I think that's really important to think about and deliver the organizational purpose at the end of the day. And so this is really important. The question to keep asking around the boardroom table is the why question. Now, why do we want to do that? What are we pursuing? Why are we pursuing it? Why are we operating in the sectors we're in? Why are we operating in the countries that we're in? Because of purpose. And certainly part of that purpose would have a financial element, but a large part of that purpose would also be governed by what other impacts are we looking for? Because ultimately an organization's purpose is summed up, and this is from the principles of purposeful business, another document that has informed ISO 37000. An organization's purpose is summed up by the positive benefit of producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. Lots of words with a P there, but the key thing is that ultimately our businesses are being held to account for the benefit we're providing, not just to ourselves, but to the people and the planet. And we've got to find ways of doing that in a profitable manner. And that's often the paradox of business, is we have to link purpose to a number of different dimensions. And so this is where, when we're asking questions about why we do things and what does that look like, we have to ask ourselves questions that deepen our thinking. And those are the questions. I always say the why question is a question that deepens our thinking, because it forces us to find the bedrock upon which we are basing things. And that's what purpose ultimately forms for us. Questions to go wider. We've got to think about that impact we have beyond just our internal aspects. We've also, and going beyond what has been termed purely externalities, because that's been used as an excuse just to say, well, it's not our, it's an externality, it's not our, of interest to us. Absolutely, in today's world, those are critical elements that we have to take into account. And then also questions that help us go higher. And I use the word higher because one of the key principles in governing is we've got to be able to see the whole of the business and understand the whole of the business. See, most of us grow up in an organizational structure or organogram where we rise up because we are good within a certain function, within a certain silo in the business. And so we legitimately see, when we're working in a business, everything from that perspective. When we sit on the board has to be able to see the whole and recognize the contribution of the parts to the whole, as opposed to just understand the perspective from the function within which you are based. Yeah? And so this is the balance between what are you contributing at board level versus your perspective on the company or the business as a whole. And so those questions about purpose are really, really critical to think through. Then lastly, I think it's the last or second last, value generation is critical, and it's a wider concept than previously. If purpose is a wider concept than previously thought through, previously anticipated, previously described, so is value generation. And value generation, as you can see, is in a sense, one of the critical things that flow from purpose. And I would argue as well that that's very strongly linked to our strategy as well. And so this cluster of purpose, value generation, strategy is foundational to not just understanding why we exist, but asking the question, what are the elements of our operating model? And so value generation is where we start thinking about our operating model, our business model, the elements we combine into the business to deliver the value that we desire to deliver. But value is broader than just money. We've got to think from a stakeholder perspective in the same way that thinking of purpose should take into account the intentions related to stakeholders. We've got to think of the various stakeholders that we impact and how are we creating positive value across that wider, deeper, broader range. And so value generation is really this concept of, and this is where imagination is important, because imagination isn't just about the future. Imagination is also about how can we best combine what we have available to us in the process of defining, creating, delivering, and sustaining value. And so one of the models I like to use essentially says that our business model typically consists of the things we do. So what we do, what we have, which is obviously the doing is our activities, what we have, our assets, the people in the business, little stick man, and the partnerships that we have with others in the wider environment. And essentially we combine those. And so we define and create value by how do we actually put all of those elements together to create a value proposition. And we've got to then deliver that to the key people who will pay for it, which is our customer base. And so that's the first part of defining, creating, and delivering value. And that obviously results in cash flow, and the money comes in to pay for all of the different elements, and it's sustainable because there is money to reinvest or to pay out to shareholders. But the word that is often missed is this concept of sustaining value over time. And so what we need to do is we need to ask the question, how do we ensure that on a timeline, this is viable and can actually not just deliver value today, but continue to deliver value viably or sustainably into the future. And so some of the skill sets or the thinking, the questions, is to recognize that ultimately you build the system to deliver what you believe to be valuable. If the only thing perceived as valuable is finance, you get what's happened around the world today, a significant financialization of business models, which often sees money as the most important thing, and so it's the only thing we focus on. If we believe that our impact in our communities, our impact on our employees, our healthy, responsible stewardship of the environment is valued, we'll build the system to deliver value across those different areas. Secondly, you measure what you value. And too often we simply measure the easy things, and money in a sense is an easy thing to measure, and that's why it's the thing that is most often measured. We've got to ask the question in the other areas I've just mentioned, what do we measure and how does that measurement reflect our value of something? Because ultimately the people in the system, their behavior, how they act, how they are perceived as acting is a product of the system that we architect and put together. And a big part of directing is obviously thinking about the future, asking the question, what do we want to achieve? Understanding the present, what do we have available? And then building the system that will move from obviously the present to the future. And some quotes that sum up the challenge of that and some of the things we need to think through. The most powerful statement managers, and I would also say that directors make ultimately, is about what is important in the organization lies in what they choose to measure. And so the communication flows in our business, the reporting flows, the things we ask people in the business to report on become critical because those are enablers of the right behavior in the business, and they reflect the purpose of the business. Eli Goldratt, he's the author of the books around the theory of constraints. He says, tell me how you measure me and I'll tell you how I behave. And that's why we often see behavior of CEOs and directors and people in business that we wonder, why did they behave that? Well, something about the system incentivized that behavior. And so we've got to go from understanding the system to understand what are the different elements of the system that we need to be accountable for as directors. And we're effectively accountable for three key aspects. And this is reflected in things like integrated reporting, the value reporting framework, which is the latest thinking about organizational reporting. We've got to firstly give an account for what goes into the business, the inputs into the business. And we are held to account because of the risk that we bring into the business when we do things like, not verify whether our supply chain is, employing children or using slave labor, or all of those other things that the supply chain, the minerals we get into our business, if we are that kind of business, bring with it some of the challenges around source and where they came from and what the impact of that was. Secondly, we do something with that business model element. What do we do with it? What is our process? We've got to understand that and be accountable for it. And obviously, thirdly, there is an output or an outcome at the end of the day. And so if we think about firstly, it's understanding. All directors need to understand their model for value generation. If we don't as directors, how do we make sense of the information we get? How do we ask for the right information? And so that's really important, because that's the thing ultimately that we are going to be held accountable for. And then the last element related to the model and what we have time for today is ISO 37000 reflects a new way of thinking about governance. And that new way of thinking about governance is called outcomes-based governance. So certainly we see this whole model that consists of from the core out. But if we think of the history of governance and the focus of attention or the priorities as that history is unfolded, if we go back to the 80s and 90s, where corporate governance or organizational governance was a new discipline, the focus was primarily around structures and systems. So the proof of good governance was whether you had structures and systems in place. Then there was a shift to say, well, actually, it's about our impact on, and how we use different elements of the business. So our business model and understanding that, giving an account not just for policies and processes, but is there a link between the policies and processes and what we want to achieve? Because what was happening is there was a lot of cutting and pasting, in a sense, of policies, and the policies then become a piece of paper as opposed to an active, alive enabler in our businesses. And so we started to see the shift happen from this structure to the people in the business as well, ethics and values becoming important. And that's what we see even here in purpose and value generation. We started to see phrases like ethical leadership in the governance, codes of corporate governance. And over time, it's morphed and developed, especially, I think, since the financial crisis, because a lot of those companies claimed that they were well governed. And yet, ultimately, when they were looked at from the outside looking in, and the outcome of what they were producing was not seen as very positive. And so in today's world, the ultimate test of good governance is that outside circle. Because if you think about it, everything in the inside is often invisible to outsiders, but outsiders very much see the performance of the business and they can measure it. And so a critical outcome of good governance is your business a business that performs? And that is obviously a combination of what are our objectives, in a sense, objectives, but also what are our controls? Are we responsible in terms of what we pursue, but are we pursuing it within a controlled environment? And internal controls, internal reporting is important. So it's also a third element of performance are the people in the business. Do we actually do we have good systems? Do we have good people? And do we ultimately achieve our objectives? And so looking from the outside, looking in, effective performance is a major test of good governance. The foundation, in a sense, is what you see at the bottom, ethical behavior. And as I mentioned, that became a very strong theme following the financial crisis, is that governance couldn't be seen as just a tick box, but actually it had to be something that flowed out of the people. And so ethical behavior, ethics in a business, values in a business, ethical culture results in the right behavior. And so we often think it's the culture of the business, but remember that the way people engage with our businesses is through the behavior they experience of the business. So the outsider looking in doesn't see necessarily all of the values on your walls, but what they experience is the behavior of your people. And so how do we govern that in such a way that results in a positive impact and a perception at the end of the day of ethical behavior? And then the third one, which is really important, is linked right back to what we said about purpose, is that purpose has to be defined broadly based on all of the different elements of the business and all of the different stakeholders in the business, in a sense. And so responsible stewardship is how are we giving an account for our broader impact? And that relates to the value generation model that I spoke about, where we've got to be able to understand and give an account for what comes into the business, what we do with it, and what are the outputs or the outcomes. And that's perceived either as being responsible from the outside looking in or irresponsible. And that's why many companies are in tough spaces, because they operate in contexts that are difficult from an environmental sensitivity point of view, or difficult from a community engagement point of view. But we as directors have to be saying, how do we ensure that the things that we do from the inside out actually ultimately result in the right outcome? Because at the end of the day, it's the outsiders looking into our business, the stakeholders that we impact and the stakeholders that influence us, that ultimately test whether our organizations are well governed or not. And so in this slide, it's also important to recognize that when we think about outcomes, is your business is currently perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes you're getting. If there are challenges around any of those outcomes, you've got to look and ask the question, what elements of your business and your system do you need to change? This is thinking that comes very strongly from the systems thinking space, where Donella Meadows, who's one of the significant writers in the systems thinking space, but also about environmental impact, she writes a lot in that space. Systems like the three wishes in a fairy tale have the terrible tendency to produce exactly and only what you ask them to produce. And so that's what we need to be thinking when we ask. And this, I suppose, and this is, in a sense, where I want to land, is to say that one of the key things directors and governors should do with ISO 37000 in mind, and as we start to engage it, is find a way to almost step outside your business. Go from that inside out only perspective to that outside in perspective, so that you can ask the question, what's really going on here? What do things really look like here? And do that accurate analysis, that accurate assessment, and then begin with the end in mind. What are we wanting to be in the future? What is the view from the top? What is this thing? What should it look like as a whole, so that we can start diagnosing where specific things happen? And those are areas that we are very involved in, and would love to help you in your businesses as you go forward and as you grow. What should they look like? Our businesses ultimately, based on those outcomes, should be ethical. They should be effective, and I like to use the word enhancing to sum up that concept of stewardship. Ethical behavior, effective performance, and enhancing. We are responsible stewards of all of the areas of the business. And so, kind of as we land, and again, I'd love to get questions or comments. And you're actually, if you want to also talk, I'm happy to also, if you put up your hand, then we can also allow you to ask the question verbally if you don't want to necessarily type it out in the chat box. But ISO 37000, it is a recognized set of guidelines and guidance. It should form part of every board agenda around the world, certainly in the short term. Why? Because it's new. It was published in September 2021, and so boards can't ignore it. You can't let it bypass, irrespective of the size of your business. Rather start early than leave it late. It's not certifiable because it's descriptive and not prescriptive. So you don't tick the box with ISO 37000, you apply it and you explain your application. It's a framework to align with best practice. It's designed to be enabling and complementary. So often people say, well, how do I deal with ISO 37000 when I have a whole lot of legislation that I'm dealing with? Well, I like to argue that the legislation provides the base upon which our businesses are built. But something like ISO 37000 provides some guidelines in terms of how we can comply with the legislation. And there's very little, if any, contradiction between the principles and the recommendations and the things we need to think through and the compliance with legislation as well. So it's enabling, it's a guidance for application ultimately. It's comparative, so it helps you compare what you're doing currently to what's recommended. It's complementary with other ISO standards. So in the document, there is reference to where we talk about some of the things we haven't really spoken about, that white circle, stakeholder engagement, risk governance. That's where a number of the other standards can assist us. And it also is inclusive. It's applicable in over 70 countries and all organizations. So it's a standard, especially if you operate in different countries, that you can apply across the board to make sure that your organizations are well governed. And so with that, I'd like to open up for questions or comments, and then we'll close with an opportunity as well. One of the things I'm going to give you an opportunity to do is to indicate whether you would like to meet with one of our senior partners, and I'll drop his calendar up onto the chat box so that you can click on that and set up some time if that's what you would like to do going forward. But any thoughts or questions or comments before we close off with that? And even Andrew, anything from your side, anything spring to mind from your side that would be helpful to pick up on, Andrew?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Roger. That was very informative. I think maybe one area that I thought you might want to touch on is how then this also ties in with our program on the ADP side, and how this training fits in very well with the applied directorship program.
Okay. So as I mentioned much earlier, I'm very involved in training directors and training boards. We use in SIDAR a methodology we like to think is very closely aligned. It's a methodology that's been around for a fair amount of time in thinking through the practical application of governance. It's called the SIDAR Governance Compass. And you can see just from the words linking, and we sometimes map it out according to ISO 37000. But what the Applied Directorship Program does is it takes all of these concepts and ideas and thoughts and puts it into a practical applied model of learning. It's an 11-month program. every month consists of a 4-hour in the classroom. It's online, but it's in the classroom session, and that's supplemented by videos and reading, and also a board simulation. So it's a very practical, applied, experiential learning exercise. And we've run, I think we literally launched our 44th applied directorship program in a little over 5 years. So significant number of programs that we've run, and because we've run it throughout Africa, we have a great experience and footprint in understanding different applications in different contexts, but also what's the same. So we talk through, and you'll see 8 of the modules are structured around the segments of the governance compass, which you can see there on your left: strategy, culture, leadership, the challenges of stakeholder engagement and sustainability, shareholder engagement, risk, etc. And that's how we've structured it. And so it's a program that, together with, alongside the 4-hour classroom session or half-day classroom session, it will take you probably 2 to 3 days per month. It's intense, it's a lot of learning, but it will equip you to both be a better governor in your own business. And I think we've seen lots and lots of people apply the principles as we go through the program, and their businesses flourish. But also for those of you who are saying, hey, I'd like to serve on another board as an independent director, it's a great learning for that as well. And we've actually run a program together with the room, so there's a number of your colleagues as well who have been through the program. So thanks, Andrew. I think that's a pertinent question to ask. How do we actually apply it? And we call it the Applied Directorship Program because it's premised on that phrase, apply and explain. Any other questions? And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to drop a poll. I'm going to launch a poll. I was just going to ask a couple of questions. What are the next steps for you? So please indicate to us, and you'll see there's the Applied Directorship Program we've mentioned there. There's a one-day event we call the High Performance Board Workshop, where we'd love to send you information as well. And then if you do want to set up a 30-minute discussion with a senior partner from Sudan, one of my partners colleagues is actually traveling to Nairobi, and I know some of you are based there. So he's available for face-to-face, and you can find if you and I'll drop that calendar link into the, whoops, let me just make sure that I get it right. I'll drop that into the chat box, and if you want to click on that Calendly, I think is how you pronounce it, link, then you'll see his diary pop up, and then you can choose some time between the 23rd and 26th. Please also indicate whether it's virtual, so he'll be in touch with you. If you're not in Nairobi, obviously we can engage with you anytime as well. Also, if you we will be sending you a copy of this presentation, and so please also get hold of us around if you'd like to, if you miss out on Tim's calendar, then we can also see if there's one of the other partners. I do have slots every now and again when I'm not presenting, so please let us know there. Any other thoughts, questions, comments before we close for the evening? And I know I've probably given you a lot to absorb. I encourage you, the diagram that I used, the ISO 37000, there is a shorter document on ISO 37000. You can find it online. To buy the standard, you would either buy it from ISO, the organization itself, or one of your local kind of representatives. But that picture is a publicly available picture, which is really helpful in thinking about governance. And as I said, we'll get you the presentation. Thanks for those responses on the poll. We'll certainly be getting in touch with you around those, and I appreciate that. So I'll leave it up for a little while longer. So thanks again for the opportunity, and I trust that it's been helpful. I trust that it's given you some food for thought in terms of your own boardrooms and your own contexts. I encourage you to pick up that diagram and say at your next board meeting, how are we going to unpack it? And then I would work my way out from the beginning. Are we clear about our purpose? Are we clear about our value generation and our strategy? And then just that respond in terms of our accountability and oversight structures, which is effectively policy. And are we good at those disciplines of stakeholder engagement, risk governance, those kind of things? Thanks, Ashok. And we'll also be sending you a thanks, Wangechi. Thanks for that. Please complete the feedback form from the room as well. Obviously, it'll be great to get some feedback, insight, what you've thought about this webinar, and that is also on the chat box. So if there's no further questions or comments, have a great evening, and I trust that sometime in the future we will meet in a room and not necessarily online. I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to end the poll, leave the chat box open for a bit so you can get that feedback form, and as I said, we'll be getting you the slides and a recording of the webinar, potentially if you require it going forward. Andrew, anything from your side?
Yes, just to say thank you very much, Roger, for taking the time to elaborate what the ISO 37 standard for corporate governance is all about, and how we can actually start applying it in our own governance practices. And just to mention, I've actually personally gone through the ADP program, the Applied Directorship program, and was fascinated. That was back in 2020. And I was fascinated how the learnings in the program actually tie in quite nicely with the new ISO 37000 standard. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this. And I would also like to thank, yes, thank you. I would also like to thank the room members who made the time to attend today's webinar. And I hope you found the session useful. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thanks so much. All the best. Cheers.
Thank you.